Picture two people receiving the exact same silence, the exact same sudden distance, the exact same confusing withdrawal from someone they care about, and watch how differently their next 24 hours unfold. One spirals, checking a phone every few minutes, drafting messages never sent, replaying the last conversation for some hidden clue about what went wrong. The other notices the distance, feels a flicker of concern, and then simply continues living, trusting that whatever is happening belongs to the other person to process. That second response is not indifference, it is security. And today, we are going to walk through exactly what security actually does, moment by moment, when an avoidant partner pulls away, so you can recognize this response clearly and begin building it within yourself. Let's begin by naming what security actually is, because this word gets used loosely without much precision. Security, within attachment psychology, does not mean never feeling hurt or never feeling uncertain when someone you love creates distance. It means possessing an internal foundation stable enough that this hurt and this uncertainty do not require immediate resolution in order to remain tolerable. A secure person absolutely notices withdrawal, absolutely feels its sting, but that sting does not hijack their entire nervous system the way it often does for someone operating from a more anxious or more fearful attachment pattern. Let's talk about the very first thing a secure person does internally the moment they notice distance beginning to form, because this initial response sets the tone for everything that follows. Rather than immediately assuming personal responsibility, rather than scanning backward through recent interactions searching for some mistake that must explain the withdrawal, a secure person tends to hold a more neutral, more curious initial hypothesis. They consider the possibility that this distance reflects something happening within the other person, some internal process entirely separate from anything they themselves did or did not do. This neutral first response, holding space for explanations beyond personal fault, prevents the immediate spiral into self-blame that often characterizes less secure reactions to the same exact situation. Let's talk about why this neutral hypothesis comes so much more naturally to someone operating from genuine security, because the difference here traces back to how each person's nervous system learned to interpret relational distance during their own formative experiences. Someone raised within reasonably consistent, reasonably attuned caregiving typically internalized a foundational sense that they are inherently worthy of love, a sense that does not require constant external confirmation in order to remain intact. When distance appears within an adult relationship, this foundational sense remains largely undisturbed, allowing curiosity rather than panic to become the default response. Someone whose formative experiences involved more inconsistency often lacks this same foundational buffer, meaning distance registers immediately as evidence against their own worth, rather than simply as information about the other person's current internal state. Let's talk about what happens specifically to a secure person's daily behavior during a period of avoidant withdrawal, because the behavioral difference here proves just as significant as the internal, cognitive difference already discussed. A secure person generally continues their own life largely unchanged, maintaining existing plans, existing commitments, existing engagement with friends and interests, without dramatically reorganizing their schedule around monitoring the other person's behavior. This continuity is not performed detachment. It reflects genuine, authentic stability, a life that was never entirely organized around this one specific relationship to begin with, and therefore does not require significant disruption simply because that relationship is currently experiencing distance. Let's talk about the specific way security shapes communication during this period, because how a secure person chooses to communicate, or chooses not to communicate, differs considerably from more anxious patterns. A secure person typically resists the urge toward repeated messages seeking reassurance or clarification, recognizing that repeated pursuit tends to increase pressure rather than resolve confusion. If communication happens at all during this period, it tends to be measured, clear, and singular rather than escalating. Perhaps a simple message acknowledging the distance and expressing openness to conversation whenever the other person feels ready, offered once rather than repeated with increasing urgency or increasing anxiety. Let's talk about what security specifically does with the discomfort that withdrawal inevitably produces, because security does not mean the absence of discomfort. It means a fundamentally different relationship with that discomfort once it arrives. A secure person tends to acknowledge their own hurt honestly, often naming it directly to themselves or to a trusted friend, rather than suppressing it entirely or performing a detachment they do not genuinely feel. This honest acknowledgement differs considerably from anxious rumination because it involves feeling the discomfort fully without then spiraling into extended, repetitive analysis designed to eliminate uncertainty through sheer mental effort. Let's talk about the specific role self-soothing plays throughout this process. Self-soothing that operates quite differently for someone with a secure foundation compared to someone lacking that same foundation. A secure person generally possesses a reasonably developed toolkit for managing their own emotional discomfort independently. Physical movement, creative expression, connection with supportive people, activities that provide genuine relief without requiring the withdrawing partner's involvement or reassurance in order to function effectively. This toolkit did not appear automatically. It typically developed through the person's own history of learning, gradually that they are capable of tolerating uncertainty and discomfort without immediate external rescue. Let's talk about what security specifically avoids doing during this period. Avoidances that matter just as significantly as the actions security actively takes. A secure person tends to avoid catastrophizing, jumping immediately to worst-case conclusions about what the distance definitely means for the relationship's future. They tend to avoid over-interpreting every small detail, reading elaborate meaning into response times or word choices that may carry considerably less significance than anxious analysis might suggest. They tend to avoid seeking reassurance from multiple sources simultaneously, repeatedly discussing the situation with various friends in search of validation that the distance is either meaningless or catastrophic, rather than simply allowing genuine uncertainty to exist without demanding premature resolution. Let's talk about how security handles the specific temptation to interpret withdrawal as a referendum on personal worth. Temptation that anyone, regardless of their general attachment security, might experience to some degree when someone they care about pulls away. The difference lies not in whether this temptation ever arises, but in how quickly and how effectively a secure person recognizes and redirects away from it. A secure person tends to notice the thought, something along the lines of wondering if they are simply not enough, and then actively countering it with more accurate, more grounded perspective, recalling their own genuine worth independent of this particular relationship's current status, recalling the psychological reality that avoidant withdrawal typically reflects internal patterns rather than partner deficiency. Let's talk about the specific way security approaches the eventual return, when and if the withdrawing partner eventually reestablishes contact or reestablishes closeness. A secure person tends to remain genuinely open to reconnection, without either rushing toward immediate, uncritical acceptance or maintaining rigid, punitive distance designed to make the other person suffer for having withdrawn. This openness comes paired with reasonable observation, watching whether the return includes any acknowledgement of the distance's impact, watching whether patterns seem likely to repeat, without allowing this observation to become anxious hypervigilance that prevents genuine reconnection from developing naturally. Let's talk about what security specifically requires from a secure person's own internal narrative throughout this entire process. Narrative that differs considerably from the more catastrophic or more self-blaming narratives common within less secure responses. A secure internal narrative might sound something like recognizing that this distance is uncomfortable but survivable, that it likely reflects something happening within the other person rather than something wrong with oneself, that time will reveal more information than immediate anxious analysis currently can, and that regardless of how this particular situation resolves, personal worth and personal stability remain fundamentally intact. Let's talk about how security handles boundaries during this period, because genuine security does not mean endless, boundaryless patience, regardless of how long distance continues or how it eventually gets addressed. A secure person tends to hold reasonably clear internal limits regarding how much continued inconsistency they are willing to accept over time. Limits that exist independently of any single instance of withdrawal, but that inform overall decision making about the relationship's sustainability should a pattern of repeated, unaddressed withdrawal continue developing across considerable time. Let's talk about the specific way security influences how someone processes their own emotions once the immediate period of withdrawal has passed, regardless of how it ultimately resolves. A secure person tends to genuinely process whatever difficult feelings arose, rather than either suppressing them entirely or allowing them to fester unexamined. This might involve honest reflection, sometimes through journaling, sometimes through conversation with trusted people, genuinely working through the discomfort, rather than simply moving past it superficially, while leaving unresolved feeling buried beneath the surface. Let's talk about what this entire pattern of secure response actually requires developmentally. Because security is not simply a personality trait some people happen to possess, while others simply lack. It develops, often gradually, through a combination of formative experience and deliberate, ongoing internal work. Someone who did not receive particularly secure attachment modeling during childhood can still develop what researchers sometimes call earned security. Security built through corrective experiences, through therapeutic work, through deliberate practice of exactly the kind of internal responses described throughout this entire discussion. Let's talk about what specific practice might help someone move toward this kind of earned security. Practice worth naming directly, rather than remaining purely theoretical. This might involve deliberately noticing anxious thoughts as they arise during moments of relational uncertainty, gently questioning their accuracy rather than immediately accepting them as fact. It might involve building genuine, reliable sources of self soothing that do not depend on any particular partner's behavior. It might involve therapeutic work, specifically addressing earlier attachment wounds, developing genuine understanding of where anxious or fearful patterns originated in order to more effectively interrupt them moving forward. Let's talk about what remains true regardless of where you currently stand along this spectrum toward genuine security. Whether you already embody much of what has been described throughout this discussion, or whether you recognize considerable distance between your own typical response and the secure response being outlined here. Security develops through practice, through repeated experience of tolerating uncertainty without catastrophizing, through repeated evidence gathered directly that you can survive discomfort without needing immediate resolution. Each time you successfully navigate a moment of relational distance, using even a small piece of the secure framework described throughout this conversation, you build genuine evidence supporting your own capacity for exactly this kind of stability. Let's talk about a specific scenario worth examining in careful detail because concrete illustration often clarifies abstract psychological concepts more effectively than description alone. Imagine receiving a shorter than usual response after several days of warm, engaged conversation. An anxious response to this shift might involve immediate assumption that something has gone seriously wrong, followed by careful rereading of every recent message, searching for the exact moment things changed, followed perhaps by a message asking directly if everything is okay, sent with visible urgency that the other person can likely sense even through text alone. A secure response to this exact same shorter message tends to look considerably different. A brief moment of noticing the change, perhaps mild curiosity, followed by continued engagement with whatever else currently occupies the day, trusting that further information will arrive naturally, rather than requiring immediate extraction through anxious inquiry. Let's talk about what specifically allows this trust to feel genuine, rather than forced or performed, because trust here deserves distinction from simple denial or simple suppression of legitimate concern. Genuine trust develops from accumulated evidence, both from this specific relationship's history and from broader life experience. that most fluctuations in someone else's availability or someone else's tone reflect ordinary, unremarkable factors, rather than catastrophic relational rupture. Someone operating from genuine security has typically experienced, repeatedly throughout their life, situations where initial worry proved unfounded, situations where patience revealed reasonable explanations rather than confirmed disaster. This accumulated evidence makes trust feel earned rather than naive, a reasonable statistical bet based on considerable prior experience rather than blind optimism disconnected from reality. Let's talk about what happens specifically when a secure person's trust occasionally proves misplaced, when patience genuinely does reveal a relationship ending or a pattern proving unsustainable, rather than simply temporary distance resolving naturally. Security does not require being right every single time about how a particular instance of distance will ultimately resolve. It requires maintaining a stable, functional response regardless of outcome, meaning even when distance does eventually confirm genuine relational trouble, a secure person navigates that confirmation from a place of relative stability rather than from a place of having spent the intervening period consumed by anxious spiraling that would have changed nothing about the eventual outcome anyway. Let's talk about the specific difference between secure patients and what might be mistaken for secure patients, but actually represents suppressed anxiety or learned helplessness instead. Genuine secure patience involves active, ongoing assessment, continuing to notice patterns, continuing to evaluate whether the relationship overall remains healthy and sustainable, while simply choosing not to demand immediate resolution during any single instance of distance. Suppressed anxiety, by contrast, often looks similar on the surface: apparent calm, apparent lack of visible reaction, but internally involves considerable unprocessed distress that gets pushed down rather than genuinely metabolized. Distress that often eventually surfaces through other channels: physical symptoms, irritability in unrelated contexts, or eventual emotional collapse once the accumulated suppression becomes unsustainable. Let's talk about how to distinguish your own response honestly. Determining whether your apparent calm during moments of relational distance reflects genuine security or reflects suppression that merely resembles security from the outside. Genuine security typically includes willingness to acknowledge discomfort openly when asked directly, saying honestly that yes, the distance feels uncomfortable, while still maintaining overall functional stability. Suppression typically includes reflexive denial that any discomfort exists at all, an insistence on being completely fine that itself often signals unprocessed feeling being actively pushed away rather than genuinely resolved. Let's talk about what specific internal dialogue might support movement toward more genuine security. Dialogue worth practicing deliberately during moments when old, anxious patterns feel tempted to activate. This might involve gently reminding yourself that discomfort is tolerable, even without immediate resolution, that your own worth does not fluctuate based on someone else's current availability, that time typically provides more accurate information than immediate anxious analysis ever could. This internal dialogue, practiced repeatedly over considerable time, gradually becomes more automatic, requiring less conscious effort as genuine security develops through sustained practice. Let's talk about the specific role professional support can play in developing this kind of earned security, particularly for people whose formative experiences involved significant inconsistency or significant relational difficulty that continues influencing their adult patterns. Therapeutic work focused specifically on attachment patterns can help identify the origins of anxious or fearful responses, providing genuine insight that supports more effective interruption of automatic patterns than self-directed effort alone often manages to achieve. This support does not represent weakness or inadequacy. It represents genuine investment in developing exactly the kind of stable, secure internal foundation this entire discussion has been describing throughout. Let's talk about what it means to celebrate small moments of secure response, even while considerable anxious pattern still remains present elsewhere within your own typical reactions. Security develops incrementally rather than arriving suddenly and completely. Noticing and genuinely acknowledging even small instances where you managed to tolerate uncertainty slightly better than your usual pattern, where you resisted sending an anxious message even though the urge was strong, where you redirected attention toward your own life even briefly during a period of relational distance, provides genuine reinforcement supporting continued growth toward more consistent, more reliable security over time. Let's talk about what genuinely secure relationships ultimately look like once both partners, or at least the partners seeking growth, have developed this kind of stable internal foundation, relationships considerably different from the anxious pursuit and avoidant retreat cycle that characterizes so much relational difficulty. These relationships involve distance without catastrophe, difficulty without spiraling, disagreement without threat to the relationship's fundamental stability. This does not mean these relationships lack challenge entirely, but it means challenge gets navigated from a place of genuine stability rather than from a place of constant anxious monitoring or constant fear of abandonment. Let's talk about the specific way a secure person approaches direct communication about the withdrawal itself, should they eventually decide that naming the pattern directly serves the relationship better than continued silent observation. This communication tends to be offered from curiosity rather than accusation, phrased in a way that invites genuine dialogue rather than triggering defensiveness. Something like expressing genuine care alongside honest observation that distance seems to be a recurring pattern, followed by genuine openness to understanding what the other person experiences during these periods, rather than a demand for immediate explanation or immediate change. This approach reflects security's underlying confidence, trusting that honest, calm communication serves the relationship better than either silent suppression or anxious confrontation. Let's talk about what happens specifically to a secure person's own self-esteem throughout an extended period of navigating a partner's repeated withdrawal, because self-esteem here deserves careful examination given how significantly repeated relational difficulty can erode confidence even in people who generally maintain fairly stable security. Security does not make someone immune to gradual erosion if a pattern continues long enough without resolution, but it does mean that erosion, when it occurs, tends to be recognized and addressed more quickly than it might be for someone lacking this same foundational stability. A secure person tends to notice when their own confidence has begun genuinely suffering, prompting reassessment of whether continued patience actually serves their own well-being or whether the relationship itself requires more significant reconsideration. Let's talk about the specific way security handles the aftermath once a pattern of withdrawal has been observed repeatedly over considerable time without meaningful change. Aftermath that often requires moving beyond simple patient tolerance toward more decisive evaluation. A secure person tends to trust their own accumulated observation at this stage, recognizing that continued hope without corresponding evidence represents wishful thinking rather than genuine security. This might involve directly communicating that the pattern has become unsustainable, clearly stating what continued relationship would require moving forward, or in some cases, recognizing that the relationship itself may not be capable of providing what genuine partnership requires, regardless of how much patience and how much stability has already been extended toward it. Let's talk about what it means to make this kind of significant decision, potentially ending or significantly restructuring the relationship, from a place of genuine security rather than from a place of anxious reactivity or exhausted defeat. A secure decision of this kind tends to feel calm even when it involves genuine grief, grounded in clear observation rather than in sudden emotional overwhelm. This does not mean the decision feels easy or painless. It means the decision reflects careful, honest assessment rather than impulsive reaction to a single difficult moment, a distinction that matters considerably for how confidently that decision can be trusted and maintained afterward. Let's talk about what specific support systems tend to reinforce and sustain genuine security throughout this entire process. Support that extends beyond simply internal psychological work into the broader structure of someone's daily life. Maintaining close friendships that offer genuine perspective and genuine emotional support helps considerably, providing external validation and external companionship that does not depend entirely on the romantic relationship's current status. Continued engagement with meaningful work, hobbies, or personal goals provides additional stability, ensuring that identity and daily satisfaction remain distributed across multiple sources rather than concentrated entirely within one uncertain relationship. Let's talk, finally, about what it genuinely means to model this kind of security for others, including potentially for the withdrawing partner themselves. Even though modeling healthy behavior never guarantees that someone else will develop similar capacity in response. Witnessing genuine, sustained security, someone who remains stable, who communicates honestly, who neither collapses into anxious pursuit nor retreats into cold punishment, can itself become a valuable, if indirect, form of relational education for a partner whose own patterns developed through very different, less secure formative experiences. This modeling never obligates change on their part, but it does offer something many people navigating avoidant patterns may never have directly witnessed before: an example of what stable, sustainable closeness genuinely looks like in practice. Let's talk about what small, daily practice toward this security might genuinely look like, practical steps worth incorporating even before full security has been achieved. This might involve pausing deliberately before sending any message during a moment of relational anxiety, allowing at least a few hours to pass, and assessing whether the urge to reach out still feels as urgent afterward. It might involve keeping a simple journal, noting moments when anxious spirals began, along with what eventually happened once the initial worry passed, building your own personal evidence base, demonstrating that most feared outcomes never actually materialized. This accumulated personal evidence, gathered directly through your own experience, rather than borrowed from anyone else's, often proves considerably more convincing than any external reassurance ever could. Let's talk about the specific patience this entire developmental process requires from you. Patience considerably longer than a single motivated week of practice would ever produce. Genuine, lasting shifts toward security typically develop across many months of consistent effort, occasionally interrupted by moments where old patterns resurface, despite considerable progress already made. This non-linear development does not indicate failure. It reflects the normal, gradual texture of genuine psychological growth, growth worth continuing to pursue regardless of how long it ultimately takes to feel fully, consistently secure. Let's talk about what genuine hope looks like throughout this developmental journey. Hope grounded in the simple, well-documented reality that attachment patterns are not permanent fixtures, but rather adaptable responses capable of genuine change given sufficient time, sufficient support, and sufficient consistent practice. Every secure person you have ever admired for their calm, grounded response to relational difficulty either developed that security through fortunate early experience or built it deliberately through exactly this kind of sustained effort, meaning the capacity you are working to develop is neither mysterious nor unavailable to you specifically. Every step you take toward tolerating uncertainty a little longer, toward trusting your own worth a little more fully, toward responding with curiosity instead of panic, moves you measurably closer to becoming exactly the kind of secure presence this entire discussion has been describing throughout. That presence is not out of reach. It is simply waiting on the other side of consistent, patient practice. And so, if you have been watching someone pull away and wondering whether your own anxious, spiraling response represents some permanent personal failing, I want you to understand that security is not a fixed trait separating people into two permanent categories. It is a skill built gradually through practice and through genuine internal work, available to you regardless of where your own patterns currently stand. The secure person navigating this exact same withdrawal is not immune to hurt. They have simply built, often through considerable effort, an internal foundation sturdy enough that hurt no longer requires immediate rescue in order to remain survivable. And that same foundation, built patiently over time, remains fully available for you to develop as well.